Hey, and welcome to this section where we are going to build a Chrome extension, which is just so freaking cool. Because Chrome extensions, if you haven't seen them, are programs that can enhance your browser experience in Chrome. This is an example called Honey. It's really brilliant because what it does is gather coupons from all over the web, and when you visit a page where you want to buy something, it gives you whatever coupons it can find online so that you can save money. And it was acquired by PayPal for $4 billion. So building Chrome extensions is huge because, everyone uses browsers, and surely what comes out of the box when you use Chrome surely hasn't thought of every single problem people might encounter when they are using browsers. And browser extensions is our way as developers to build solutions around these problems. Here's another one, Grammarly. I use it all the time here. So when I write for example, when I write tweets, it sits on top of Chrome and checks my spelling because it has access to what I do on the page and then suggests how I should improve my spelling and my writing in general. And this one right here is a lifesaver. It's motion and it saves me hours every single day by stopping me right before I try to enter, for example, Facebook. And it does this with a ton of other distracting sites as well so that I can focus on what matters. Like, for example, creating courses on Scrimba or writing code or doing productive stuff. So cool. If you want to check out more extensions, you can head over to chrome.google.com/webstore. There you can search through all of them. And also, if you want to open your extensions in Chrome, just click this puzzle icon in the top right corner and you'll see all of your extensions. And here you can see Leads Tracker. What's that? Well, that is the one we are going to build in this section. It is based on an insight I had when I worked as a developer in a company called Zenera, which is a provider of price information for people who are shipping containers. Because what I saw there was that the sales team at that company spent countless hours tracking down leads, or sourcing leads as they also call it. And that is looking for people online who might be interested in your product. So what they do is browse through a bunch of pages and look at people and no, this guy is probably not interested in our product. This one neither. Yes, here we have a potential customer. Let's save this one to our system. Moving on, this person does not look like a potential customer, but this one does. Yeah, and this one does as well. But this one does not look like a potential customer. So what they then had to do is take these 3 potential customers and store them somewhere so that they could reach out to them in the next phase. And this is something that basically every single sales representative does, because you need people to sell to, so you need to find them somewhere. So our Leads Tracker will be a tool for these kinds of people. The way it works is that you visit a website, for example, a profile on LinkedIn, and then you open up the extensions, click on the Leads Tracker, and there you can see you get the ability to save input. That is any URL that you pass into this input field, or hit Save Tab. If you hit Save Tab, our extension heads over to this tab, grabs the URL, and saves it in a list. And then you can move on to another page, for example, my LinkedIn page, and then hit Save Tab again, and boom, there we have the URL to my profile. And then moving on, this is Sindre, our CTO in Scrimba. Yet again, we click Save Tab, and his profile URL is saved. And this data is persisted, so you can close down the app or Chrome, turn off your computer, and when you come back, it's still there. So that you, as a sales representative, can then grab these leads and do something else with it. So this is actually a pretty useful tool for sales representatives. And it's actually deployed in the browser so that you can use it in the real world. And the point with this is to give you the powers to do this, to actually create a Chrome extension that has value, and also give you the skills you need to deploy it to someone's browser. So once you've learned this, I would really recommend you to look for opportunities, look for problems you see out in the world. Maybe there's a problem you have, or someone you study with, or someone you work with, or just a problem someone tells you about. When you come across problems people have, I want you to think, can I build a Chrome extension to help solve this problem? Because if you can do that, you truly have a superpower. That'll manifest itself in opportunities that you will get throughout your career if you're just willing to use that superpower, which JavaScript and web development is. So this was a long introduction. I hope you are as excited as me. Let's just move on and build your very first Chrome extension. Okay, in this challenge, you are going to create the basic markup we need in order to start building our app. So you are to create an input element, which is of a type text and has the ID of input-L. And then you're going to create a save input button. That is the one the user will click in order to save the input. And it should have the ID of input-btn. And here, save input should be the text inside the button. So go ahead and do this right now. Okay, let's do this. I'll start with the input and give it a type of text and ID of input L. And the input element is a so-called void or empty tag, meaning it only has an opening tag. So you're not supposed to create closing tag because you're not meant to write anything in between input tags. It is the user that is meant to add the input. So this is how you create an input tag, which as mentioned, are often called void or empty tags, or you'll also hear them referred to as self-closing tags. Anyway, let's move on to the button. Do button. That is not a void tag. It should have a closing tag and an opening tag. And in between, we are going to write save input. And the ID is set here as input.btn. If we now run this code, you can see, yes, indeed, we have an input field and a button. Great job. One pixel, solid, and then use this green color here, like that. Starting to look good. Now we can actually continue with the button. The first thing is the background color, which is green. We'll do background and use this green color again, like that. Okay. Also, the text is white, color white, like that. You can see there's also padding here as well, which we need to add. There's a little bit more padding on the left and right hand side. Let's try padding top of 10 pixels and padding bottom of 10 pixels. And then padding left of 20 pixels. Yeah, starting to look good. Padding right of 20 pixels. And now I actually want to clean up our code a little bit because you can see we're using this very verbose way of writing paddings both here and here. Whereas in the body, as you have learned previously in this career path, you can use the shorthand. And if all of the top, bottom, left, right are of the same value, we can just use padding. So I can remove all of these and do padding 10 pixels. Here, it's a little bit more complex, but the top and bottom are identical and the left and right are identical. What we then can use is padding and then 10 pixels for the top and bottom, and then 20 pixels for the left and right. So the first value kind of becomes the y-axis, above and below, and the second value becomes the x-axis, to the left and to the right. If I remove this, you can now see that it looks identical as how we had it previously, but we've removed a ton of lines, which is good. Now, another thing on the button is that it has these default borders. We don't want that according to our design. So we'll do border none, like that. Now it's really starting to look similar, but there's two things. We want to bold the text and we need a little gap between the input field and the button. So font weight, set it to bold, yes. And the gap between the button and the input can be added to either of the elements. I'm going to add it to the input field. You can use a margin button and set it to, for example, 4 pixels. There we go. Now we have something that looks pretty much like what we have, and it's also responsive, so we are ready to move on. Okay, now we are going to move from the CSS over to the JavaScript, because we have to make our input button work. And while you won't make it useful in this cast, you will at least have it log out button clicked when the user clicks it. So, you know how to do this. You're going to have to modify both some HTML and write a function in the JavaScript file. So go ahead and do it so that when I click the Save Input button, the console will log out button clicked. And once you are done, return back to the screencast and I will show you the solution as well. Good luck. Okay, hopefully you remembered that the way to do this is to create an onClick handler on the button. And there you want to type the name of the function you want to trigger. Let's call this function saveLead, for example, open and close parentheses. Then we'll head over to the index.js file and create that function, save lead, like that, and inside of it, we'll do console log button clicked, like that. We'll run the code, click the button, and indeed we are logging out button clicked. Great job. So, while this way of writing event listeners, where we define a function and trigger it via the onClick attribute in the HTML, works perfectly fine, out in the wild, you'll most likely see professional developers use a slightly different technique. So it's important that you learn that one as well. And the way we do that is by first grabbing a hold of the ID of the element we want to hook an event listener onto. So we'll do let input btn equals document dot get element by ID, passing in the input dash btn. And then what I'll do is input btn dot add event listener, like that. And inside of the add event listener function or method, which it's also called, I'll first specify what kind of event I want to listen for. And here it is the click event. And then I'll write a comma and do something which might look a little bit weird, because now we are going to define what are we going to do when someone clicks on this input button. Well, we are going to invoke a function, and in order to invoke that function, we first have to write it. So I'll do function, open and close parentheses, and then the curly brackets, and break it onto a new line. And inside of this function, we can write whatever code we want to be executed when the user clicks on this input button. So here we'll do console.log button clicked from add event listener, like that. And let's change this to button clicked from onClick attribute. Now, if we run this code, hit the button, you can see both this line and this line is executed. However, now we can actually remove this onClick event listener from our HTML. And some would say that this results in a cleaner separation of concerns, where the HTML doesn't worry about any event listeners, as that's all gathered in the JavaScript. So, of course, then we should also remove the save lead function. And we're left with this. Running the code, clicking the button, and only this line triggers. So, in the next cast, you are going to get some practice writing this type of event listeners. So let's dive into it. So, in this challenge, you are going to practice writing event listeners using the technique you just learned. So it's a 3-part challenge where you first are to grab the box from the DOM and store it in a variable. Here you can see the box. It's just a rectangle that says open the box. You can imagine that this is some kind of Easter egg on an e-commerce website where if you open the box, you get a coupon or something like that. And as for HTML, it's just a very simple div with an ID of box. And of course, I've styled it a little bit in the CSS file, but we're not going to worry about that. So when you have grabbed the box from the DOM and stored it in a variable, you are to add a click event listener to it. And then finally log out, I want to open the box when the box is clicked. So if you struggle to remember how to add an event listener using JavaScript, you can go back and rewatch how I explained that, or even better, Google it out, and you should find the solution as well. With that, go ahead and solve this challenge right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this. So we'll do let box equals document dot get element by ID, passing in box. And then to add the event listener, it's box dot add event listener, passing in first the event we want to listen for. That is the click. And then what do we want to trigger when the user clicks? Well, it's this function right here. And inside of it, we're going to console.log. I want to open the box, like that. Let's run the code, click the box, and yes, it works. Great job. And indeed, it works. Great job. Let's move on. Now we need to set up the infrastructure for being able to actually save the leads that we enter into our input field. For that, we need 2 variables. First, a myLeads variable, which should be assigned to an empty array. Secondly, the inputL variable, which should be assigned to the text input field. With that, I mean the input field right here. So go ahead and create these two variables right now. Okay, the way to do this is let my leads equals an empty array like that. And for the input.l, you probably did let input.l equals document get element by ID, passing in the input.l. However, what I'm going to do is to swap out this let with const. That's weird. Why am I doing that? You might wonder. And that is because in modern JavaScript, developers use both let and const to declare variables. And now I think it's about time that you learn both of these methods. So we're going to set the input.l as a const and also the input btn. Now, the main difference between const and let is that const cannot be reassigned. And the name kind of hints to that. It says const, which is short for constant. So whatever you assign it to should be constant, meaning you can't reassign it. And if you don't remember what reassignment is, it's when you do input.l, for example, equals hello. This won't work. If I run this code, you can actually see assignment to constant variable. I tried to assign the input.l, however, it's a constant, so JavaScript is saying, not allowed. Now, you might ask, why do we need this? This seems to be something that just makes it more difficult for us to code, because it gives us less freedom. Well, that is a very good question. So in the next cast, we'll dig into exactly that so that you properly understand why you want to use both let and const, and actually get some practice using both of these variable types. Let's return back to our lead tracker app. Okay, we are back in our lead tracker app, and now we need to make sure that when the user hits the save input button, a lead is pushed to the my leads array. For now, you're just going to use a hard-coded lead, so www.awesomelead.com, for example, and that value should be pushed to my array when the input button is clicked. So go ahead and give this a shot right now. Okay, hopefully what you did was to here inside of the body of this function, write my leads.push and then pass in www.awesomelead.com like that. If we now also console log out the my leads array like that, we will actually verify that it works. I'll hit the save input button, and there you can see we now have one lead in the my leads array. If I hit it again, we have 2 and 3 and 4. However, it's pretty useless because we're just pushing the exact same thing to the array, so let's fix up that in the next cast. Okay, so now we are going to take whatever the user enters into the input field right here and push that value into the my leads array when the save input button is clicked. So push the value from the input.l into the my leads array instead of the hard-coded www.awesomeleads.com value right here. However, I haven't taught you how to actually get the value from the input.l. That is, for example, this www.example value right here. So you need to Google that. And that's great practice because Googling is, as you know, something professional developers do every single day. So here is what I recommend you to Google. Try to find, for example, a Stack Overflow question and see if you can figure it out on your own. If you don't, no worries, I will solve this for you when you return back to this cast. So go ahead and do this right now. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's take a look at how we can find the answer to this by Googling. So we'll take the get value from input field JavaScript, which is my suggested string, and just paste it into Google. There you can see we are getting a ton of results. The first one is W3 schools. I want to go to stackoverflow.com, so I'll click here. go into Stack Overflow, and here we can see the question being asked. It seems super relevant for us, and it's been viewed 2.5 million times, so super relevant for a lot of other people as well. Let's scroll down a little bit to the answers, because that's where the juice is. Here we can see there are various methods to get an input text box value directly. And here, method 1, that's probably what we want. You can see document.getElementById, passing in an ID, and doing .value. Oh, that's pretty handy. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we already have the document getElementById, and we have stored that in the input L variable. So perhaps we simply can do input L dot value then. Let's now refresh this and do www.samplelead.com, save input, and yes, we can see in our console that we have pushed the value we entered into the input field. Lead2.com, save input, and that works as well. Great job, let's move on. Okay, now that we're able to take the input value and push it into the myLeads array so that we store our data, it's time to set the stage for going the other way around as well, meaning rendering out the leads. And as you might remember, when you want to render all of the items of an array out, you first need to loop through that array and grab each of the items. And that's exactly what you're going to do in this challenge. However, to begin with, you are going to work with some dummy data just to make it a little bit easier for you. So I've pasted in 3 dummy leads in the myLeads array here, so that down here, starting on line 12, you can simply write out a for loop that logs out the items in the myLeads array. Hopefully you remember how to do this, and if not, no worries, I will of course show you the solution afterwards as well. But go ahead and give this your best shot right now. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do this. We'll do for let I equal 0, because we want to start at the 0th index of the myLeads array. I should be less than the length of the array. So that's myLeads.length. And we want to increment I upwards with 1 for each step. Then the inside of the body of the for loop will simply console log out the myLeads using the I, our iterator, as the index. Now we run this code. You can see in the console, yes, we are indeed logging out all 3 of our dummy leads. Great job. Next up, we are going to transform this for loop from simply logging out the leads to actually rendering them out on the page. However, in order to do that, we have to actually create that unordered list where we are to render the leads out. So you are going to do that through a 2-part challenge. The first part is to create the unordered list element, the UL, with an ID of UL-L, that's for unordered list element. And then after you've done that, return back to the JavaScript and grab this unordered list and store it in a const variable that's called ULL. A little bit of a weird name there, but of course also short for unordered list element with the camel case convention we're using in JavaScript. So once we've done that, we have set the stage for actually rendering the data out instead of just logging it, so that we can do that in the following lessons. So go ahead and solve this 2-part challenge right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this together. Starting in the HTML, we need to create the unordered list, UL, and closing the tag, giving it an ID of UL-L. That, if we run the code, nothing happens in the browser because the element is empty. So let's just move on to the next part. Here we are to create a const, call it ULL, and set it to document.getElementById, passing in UL-EL, like that. Now, just to make sure that we've done everything correctly, let's console log out this element. Run the code, and there we can see it is being logged to the console. Good job solving this one. Let's move on. Now you are going to render the leads out in the unordered list we just created using the .textContent property, which we've used in previous sections. So you are to replace the console log here with the rendering of each item into the unordered list. Now, what will happen here is that you'll simply render out plain text inside of an unordered list, for example, www.awesomelead.com. If we run this, this is how it will look. And as you hopefully know, this is not how we write list items inside of an unordered list. The way to do it originally is to use li elements, like that. You run the code so that we get this dot signaling that it's a list item. However, for now, you are simply going to render out plain text inside of the unordered list. So we're kind of doing it wrong first, and then we'll fix it up later. So just go ahead and render all the leads as plain text inside of the unordered list using .textContent, even though that's not the correct way to do it. But I want you to do that first because the most important thing is to make it work and then we make it better. That's the philosophy here. So I'm going to rerun this page so that we don't have any leftovers from when we looked at the HTML. Now we just have an empty unordered list. Go ahead and do this right now. Okay, hopefully this went well. To do it, you do ULL, you'd grab a hold of the unordered list, .textContent, and here you might have been tempted to say equal my leads, and then the index. Let's see what happens if you try that. It only renders out great lead, which is the final one. The reason for that is that at each step in the iteration of the for loop, you cleared out the entire text and assigned it to whatever lead you were looking at that step in the iteration. So for a split second, the value of the text content was awesome lead. For another split second, it was epic lead. And then finally, it was cleared out yet again and set to great lead. And that is what we are seeing in the browser now, since the for loop then stopped. It had looped through the entire loop and it then broke out of the loop. So what we rather need to do is plus equals, something we also did in our poker game, if you remember that. That'll take the previous value and then concatenate it with the current lead we're looking at. So if we run this, you can see now we have all three leads rendered out, but it looks horrible. We want to add at least a space in between them. So if you remember that, you can do that with plus and then a space. Now it looks slightly better. If we shrinken the screen, they actually break out on separate lines. But if we enlarge the screen, they are just rendered out in one line. So this is still the wrong way of doing it, since we've just added plain text inside of the unordered list. We want to add list items. Now we at least know how to take the data in my leads and render it out on the page. And we also know how to take whatever the user inputs into the input field and push that value into the lead. So we kind of have a very simple implementation of each part of the app that we simply need to put together so that we at least have a working first version. So let's continue on. Okay, now we need to fix the fact that we are simply rendering out plain text strings like this inside of the unordered list. Because that's not what we want. We want to wrap them in list tags, of course, like this. So in order to do that, let's first just try to add, for example, an li opening tag before the lead and an li closing tag after the lead. To run this, you can see, we simply rendered out the HTML tags as plain strings. That's not what we want. We want our browser to parse this as HTML so that it can really turn them into list items. And the way to do that, actually, is simply replacing this text content property with something called inner HTML. If we do that and run the code, you can see there. Now we have them as proper list items with these bullets that are included on the default styling of list items. So this means that the browser actually looked at this string right here and understood, okay, this is actually the starting of a list element. I'm going to avoid rendering that out as a plain string and instead convert this entire thing to a list item. So this opens up a whole new world of manipulating the DOM. Suddenly you can create HTML elements with JavaScript. So let's take a closer look at inner HTML and give you some practice on how to use it. Back for doing this, and let's move on. Okay, let's continue on with our e-commerce website. Because let's say that you want to thank the user after she's made a purchase. That's a nice thing to do. So what we want to do is that when the user has clicked the button, we are to render a paragraph under the button, but still inside of the same container. So this container right here in which the button is rendered inside of. And the paragraph should say, "Thank you for buying." So I'm going to help you a little bit on the way here by creating an on-click event listener inside of the button that will try to invoke a function called buy when the button is clicked. So your job then is, of course, to create that buy function and have it render a paragraph inside of this container using .innerHTML so that the user is thanked. And one thing, we don't want to remove the button. When you render this paragraph, it should be under the button. So go ahead and give this your best shot right now. Okay, let's do this. We'll do function buy, and then inside of the body of the function, we need to target the container yet again, container, and its inner HTML. However, if we try now to just render out a paragraph like this, and run the code, click the buy button, then we lost our button, because here we just cleared out the inner HTML. And say we want whatever's inside of the container right now, we don't care about it. We want to set it equal to this paragraph and this paragraph only. What we instead have to do is use our good old friend plus equals. So now, if we run this code again, hit buy, and there we go. Thank you for buying, neatly placed underneath the button. Great job. Okay, we are back at our Chrome extension app, and now your job is to do exactly what I did a few casts ago. I replaced the text content with the inner HTML so that we could render proper li tags instead of just plain text inside of our unordered list. That is this element right here. So go ahead and use your freshly acquired knowledge about inner HTML to solve this challenge. Okay, hopefully that went well. The way to do it would be to first add a opening tag before our leads is rendered out. We'll do that with a double quote and li, and then of course a plus. Now, we already had this empty space previously. We don't need that anymore, but we do need a closing li tag. If we now run this, you can see, oh, it doesn't work. Well, that is because we're still using .text content. We have to change it to inner HTML, like that. Running the code, there we go. 3 list tags rendered out exactly how we want them. Let's move on. Now that you've finally managed to work with inner HTML, I'm going to be a little bit annoying and teach you an alternative way of solving this that doesn't use inner HTML. Because while I prefer to make a lot of the choices for you as to which technologies you should use to build apps, especially as a beginner, in this case, it makes sense that you learn it in 2 different ways, even though we're only going to proceed with one way in this app, and that is the .innerHTML. But you will see this other method being used both in Scrimba's front-end developer career path and out in the world. So I'm going to teach it to you. The way to understand it is to break this line of code into 3 steps, because let's have a look at what's actually happening here. So first, we are kind of creating the li element. So create element, and then we are setting the text content of that element. Finally, we are taking that expression and kind of appending it to the unordered list, because appending means to add something at the end of a document. So append to unordered list. So with this, we have the pseudocode for our solution. Let's now comment out the original way of doing it, and then write out the new way. So the first thing we need to do, create the element. That is done by document.create create element. It looks almost like these document.getElementById here. However, now we are creating something, not fetching. And what are we creating? Well, whatever we place inside of the parentheses. Naturally, in our case, this would be an li element. And this is how we specify it. We don't need to wrap it in these HTML tag symbols. Now we have created the list element, so we need to store it in a variable. I'm going to use const li. And next up, we got to set the text content. So we'll do li.textContent equals my leads I. Okay, final step, appending it to the UL element. Well, then we'll do ULL.append. And what do you think will append? Well, the li, of course. So we'll take this and pass it in there. Now, if I run this code, you can see it works. However, in my opinion, this is easier to understand intuitively than these 3 lines. Because here we get to see at least the HTML element in a more humanly readable way. But you will come across this method as well. So now what I want you to do is basically do the same thing as I did. Try to make this work with the new method and with this line of code, comment it out. And if you need help, you can use this pseudocode to Google your way to the solution, or you can of course go back and watch how I did it. But after you've done it, I'm not going to go through it again because I've already done exactly that. This is just a little digression for you to get this practice of doing it another way. And then when you're done, we are going to return back to this .innerHTML method here from the next cast and work a little bit on the performance of our solution. So give this a shot right now, and then I'll see you in the next cast. Now it's time to improve the performance of our rendering by first creating a variable list items to hold all of the HTML, and then concatenating the HTML elements onto that variable so that you, after the loop has finished, can render all of them in one go. So just to go through this is a 3-part challenge where you first create the empty variable, which you should call list items, and that should eventually hold all of the HTML for the list items. But to begin with, you are going to assign it to an empty string. Then inside of the for loop, instead of manipulating the DOM every single time the loop runs, in every iteration of the loop, we're going to rather add the item, this one right here, to the list items variable instead of using the inner HTML on the unordered list itself. And then finally, after the for loop has completed, then you can take the list items, which now contain all of the HTML you need, then render it inside the unordered list using inner HTML. So this way, we'll make our code more performant and faster. So go ahead and give this a shot right now. Okay, hopefully this went well. Now let's do this. First, I'll start with the list items. I'm going to have to use a let for that one, else it's going to be reassigned, as you know. And for that, we cannot use consts. So to begin with, it should be an empty string like that. And here we're going to add the items, these guys, to the list items variable instead of setting the inner HTML directly. So this is simply replacing this here with list items. And now after this code has been running 3 times, 1 for each lead in our array, this list items variable should contain all of the HTML we need. So then we can render it out by doing ull.innerHTML equals list items, like that. Let's try this, run the code, and as you can see, we get the exact same result, meaning that it works. If you're still a little bit confused of what's going on here, I would recommend you to, for example, console log out the value of list items so that you get to see what the value of that string is in every iteration throughout the loop. And once you feel you have a good grasp of this, we'll move on to the next lesson. If you find yourself struggling to remember as to whether or not the performant way was to do .innerHTML inside of the loop or outside of the loop, you can remember this sentence. DOM manipulation comes with a cost. And with that, you can ask, well, if it comes with a cost, is it best to manipulate the DOM, namely using inner HTML, 3 times inside of the for loop? Or is it best to just do it 1 time outside of the for loop? Well, if it has a cost, you'd prefer to do it 1 time than 3 times. So just remember that DOM manipulation has a cost, and look at your code in the light of that. Now finally, if you are a bit confused of what's really going on under the hood with this string that we are constructing by running through our loop, what you can do is log out list items down here under line 16 just to inspect how it looks in every iteration of the loop. So feel free to jump in and do that right now, and when you are ready, I will see you in the next lesson. Okay, now that we have many of the pieces of our app working, let's stitch them together so that when a user enters a lead and hits the save input button, it'll actually be rendered out, as opposed to us having to actually add the dummy data from the get-go, hard coding it here on line 1. So I'm going to remove these lines, and your job is split into two. First, you are to wrap the code below, that is from line 13 to 17, in a render leads function, and then you are to call render leads function inside of the event handler for the button clicks. And I'm going to remove this console log right here to make it a bit cleaner. So just to talk through the logic here, what will happen is that when the user adds something into the input field and hits the save input, this epic lead, as you know, will be pushed to the myLeads array. And then if we call the render leads and have this wrapped inside of that render leads function, it should, according to our plan, render out whatever items there are inside of the myLeads array, which would be much better than what we have now, where simply I can hit the save input as much as I want, but nothing happens. My lead just stays in the input field. Not good. So go ahead and try to knock this one out. Okay, hopefully that went well. Now let's do this. I'll write function, render leads, and then the body of the function. Inside of that, I will copy this code and also tab it out so that it's easier to read, like this, looking good. And then we are to call the render leads function. We do that by doing render leads and adding the open and close parentheses. Now, if we run the code, www.epiclead.com, save input, yes, it works. I do www.awesomelead.com. Woohoo! It actually works. Really good job. Now we have stitched together the various pieces of our app, and we have what looks like a functional prototype. You should be really proud of yourself reaching this far. So give yourself a pat on the back, and when you are ready, let's move on. So, while our app now works, it has a little bit of a usability issue, because if I now try to add a lead here, and hit save, you can see it is indeed saved, but it still persists in the input field as well. Most likely, we'd want to clear out this input field. So that is what I now want you to do here on line 8, clear out the input field, though I haven't told you how to do that. And that is intentional, because now I want you to Google it. And even better, I want you to try to figure out on your own what you want to write into Google to try to solve this issue. So I'm not going to give you the text you are to paste into Google this time. You just have to try and figure that out on your own and see if you can find the answer, because that's a critical skill as a developer. You'll come across problems out in the wild every single day, and you won't have me there to tell you what to Google. So you obviously have to learn how to think of a phrase to Google yourself. So go ahead and do that. Try to figure out how you can clear the input field. Write the code you think works, test it out, and then, of course, return back to this screencast when you want to see my solution. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries, let's do this together. So I would, for example, Google clear input value with JavaScript. Here you can see we get a ton of results. I normally jump to the Stack Overflow question, so let's click into that one. You can see HTML how to clear input using JavaScript. So this user is using a slightly different technique than us with a function and something called a target. However, most of the time I hardly even read this. I just quickly scroll down to the first answer to see if there's some kind of hint there as to what we are to do. And in here, you can almost ignore all of it, except for the line in the middle here that says target.value equals an empty string. That's interesting. That looks like something we can use. So here, perhaps we can do input_l.value and set that to an empty string. Input_l.value equals like that. Let's run the code. We'll do read3.com, save input, and indeed, it worked. So, great job. Let's move on. Okay, now our job is to make our leads list clickable, because as you can see here on the LI item over in the browser, this is just plain text, whereas we want it to be a link so that after a sales representative has gathered all of the leads, she can click and check them out again at a later stage if she wants to. So in order to do that, we need to wrap the lead in an anchor tag, that's the A tag, inside of the list item. So you need to change this expression here so that my leads is also wrapped in an anchor tag. And then you need to use the href attribute to point to the specific URL, which is the same as the text you are rendering out. And I also want you to make the link open in a new tab. And if you don't remember how to do that, it's super easy to forget. You'll just have to Google it out and figure it out on your own. So go ahead and knock this one out and then return back when you want to see my solution. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries, let's do this together. So we want the anchor tag on the inside of the li tag. So I'm going to add in the same strings as we are creating the li elements, an anchor element as well. So like that. And I'm going to set the href now just to this hashtag symbol right here. And then I'm going to close the anchor tag on this side. If we run the code, to add awesome lead into the input and save it, there we indeed can see that we get the default link styling. So our link works. Now at this point you might wonder, well, why am I using single quotes for the value of the href? Why isn't it wrapped in double quotes as you might have seen people do other places when writing HTML? Well, that is because here we're using the double quotes to tell JavaScript that we're working with a string. And if we then use a double quote here as well, then we're actually ending the string here as opposed to ending it here. So this is a little bit complicated. When you start having strings that need quotes inside them, then you have to use either single quotes on the inside and double quotes on the outside, or the opposite. And now this actually becomes even more complex, because what we need to do is inside of here, replace this hashtag with the my leads, because it's going to point to that URL as well. How do we do that? Well, now we actually need to close off the string before the hashtag, because we're going to add a JavaScript variable. So then we will add the double quote, a plus sign, and then a plus again, and then a double quote yet again to start this string right here. Of course, then this hashtag now serves no purpose. It's just an invalid character in JavaScript. We need to replace that with the my leads. So you can remove this space right here. Now, if we actually console log out the list items, you run the code and try to save an input as well again, then you can see we are getting an expression which looks like valid HTML. One more thing we need to do is to make the link open in a new tab, and I told you to Google that, so let's just do that as well. And here I would just Google href open in new tab, and actually Google is smart enough to just give us the answer at the top here. You can see it's pulled it from this rapidtables.com article. And here you can see, in order to open a link in a new window or tab, add target equals underscore blank inside of the h tag. All right. Well, I'll do target equals. And what kind of quotes do we need to use now on the inside of the string? Well, we need to use single quotes, underscore blank. Otherwise, we would have escaped out of the string again and into JavaScript land. And we don't want to do that. This is just a string, and we don't need any JavaScript variables to express it. Now, one thing is that when you try to click these links in the Scrimba browser, even though you're using target blank, it won't work properly. It'll open up a new tab which just has a super weird URL. That's just a Scrimba quirk, so don't worry about that. If you run this code from your local computer, this anchor tag will indeed work. Anyway, now we have all of this, and it works. However, this string is really long and ugly in my opinion. It's a complicated expression. And I would like us to simplify it and avoid using these mix of single and double quotes and all of these plus signs. And maybe we also want to write this expression on multiple lines, as you normally do in HTML. However, that won't work. As you can see, it breaks our entire code in syntax highlighting, seen by the fact that the syntax highlighting is completely off at this point. So in the next cast, I'm going to teach you about template strings, which will solve exactly that. So just stay tuned and I'll see you there. So in order to make this expression a lot simpler, we'll use what's called template strings. And to make it super clear for you, the benefit of template strings, I'm actually going to comment out this current string and then on a new line, create the template string so that you can compare the two. And the way you turn a normal string into a template string is by replacing the quotes that wrap the string with backticks instead. So let's do that and pay attention to what happens with the syntax highlighting of my leads and the plus operators when we do that. I'm going to do that and that. As you can see, it all just became blue. So now this is no longer a JavaScript expression. It's just a string. But we are of course going to fix that after we've looked at the first huge benefit with template strings, which is that you can break it into multiple lines. Something we couldn't do with a normal double quote string up here. So this gives us the opportunity to write our HTML much like our HTML looks like in an HTML file, like this. This is a much easier expression for us humans to parse than this one up here. So now we have that. It's time to take these sections here, which previously rendered out the leads, but now just are plain strings, and simply delete them and replace them with a $, open and close curly brackets. Then passing in whatever JavaScript expression we want inside there. This is how you kind of escape out of the string and shove the JavaScript expression into the string. In my opinion, much easier than what we had here with the quote, the plus, then the expression, then another plus, then a quote. Simply replace all that with this. And now if you want to go even further, we can add the contents of the anchor tag in a new line so that we get this really nicely formatted expression. It looks just like we would write it in the HTML file. If we now run this code, save the input, it works just as it did previously. But now we have removed all of the ugly pluses, all of this wrestling we had to do between single quotes and double quotes and make sure that we used each of them in proper order. Here we can do whatever we want. We can even replace this here with a double quote and use single quotes there. Well, that's not a good practice. This just shows the power of the template string. But now I've been writing code for far too long. The point here is that you should write the code. That's what Scrimba is all about. So over the next few lessons, you are going to get your hands dirty with template strings. Now you are going to practice template strings, or template literals, as people also call it. I prefer template strings though, as that's just an easier expression. Your job is to take this string, which is a concatenation of two hard-coded strings and a variable, and turn it into a template string. I'm console logging it down here on line 8 so that you can see results. If we run it, you can see that it says, "Hey James, how's it going? Chairs pair." So go ahead and change this from a standard double quote string into a template string. And then of course I will show you the solution when you are done. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do this. I'll start by simply replacing the first double quote with a backtick and the last double quote with a backtick. Then the entire thing is a string. So now if we run this, it'll say, "Hey, plus recipient, how's it going?" Obviously not what we want. We want James to be logged out as well. So we can remove all of this clutter, all of these plus and quotes, and do $, open and close curly brackets, and then type in recipient. Run this. Yes, it's now a template string. Great job. Let's make our email variable even more dynamic so that it also can take a sender value, which is the person sending the email. So you are to create a new variable and call it sender and set its value to your name. Then in the email template string, you are to use your sender variable instead of pair. So you're going to replace this text with your variable. Then just run the code and you will verify that it works through the console log. Good luck. Okay, let's do this. We'll create a const, call it sender, and I'll actually set it to my entire name here, Harold Morgan, so that we can see that it actually works when we log it out. Escaping out of the string and do sender like that. Run this. Yes. Now we are logging out my entire name at the end of the string. Great job. You will only see one line regardless of how many lines the string actually consists. Here is an example where I've created this random string, which is on 3 different lines. You can see that in the Scrimba console, we're logging it out on a single line. Whereas in the DevTools, which I've opened here, in the console that lives in the DevTools, it is indeed logged out over 3 lines. So this is a quirk with the Scrimba console. It's not as robust as the Chrome console, basically. So for this challenge, you'll have to open up the original browser console in order to verify that you've done it correctly. And if you don't know how to open the developer tools, I will show you now. When you're in the scrim, move your cursor up to the header area of the scrim, then right click so that you open this menu, click on inspect, and that'll open up the developer tools. Make sure you are on the console tab. Now, of course, this is how it works in Chrome, and I'm on the Mac computer myself. So if you are on a different operating system and using a different browser, it might be slightly different ways of opening up the console, but that shouldn't be a problem. If so, you just need to Google it out, how to open the console on Windows using Firefox, for example. So go ahead now, break the email string into multiple lines, log it out, and then open the console to verify that you've done it correctly. Okay, hopefully that went well. The way to do this is super simple. You can just break this into a new line, this into a new line, and actually you can even do this, and sometimes I even like to format this as we're writing a function body or HTML so that I tab it out so that we see it like this. But you could do it like this if you wanted, or you could do it like this. I mean, the point here wasn't exactly formatted the way I would do it. The point was just to break it into new lines, run the code, see that in the Scrimba console is still just one line. Hopefully you saw that when you logged it out in the original console, it became multiple lines. Great job. Okay, we are back at our Chrome extension app, and now you are going to do the same thing I did before we went on our little tangent about template strings, which is to take this list items and turn the string here into a template string, so that you can get rid of all of these pluses, all of these double quotes, and also break it into multiple lines if you want. So go ahead and do that right now. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do it together. Start by replacing the outer quotes with backticks, and then I'll just go ahead and break it into multiple lines to get better readability. Like that. Now we can easily see that it's a list item which wraps an anchor tag. I'm going to put this on a new line. And here we still have these clunky plus signs. I'll remove all of those and wrap the JavaScript expression here in a $sign and the brackets like that. And then do the exact same thing here. Well, like that. Even break this into yet another line, so now it looks much better. And if we run this, it still works exactly how we want it to. So let's move on. To do, as long as we're understanding the future possible consequences of doing that. And now I think we do that. So let's just move on. So even though we haven't completed our app yet, there's still many features left to build. I want to go ahead and deploy it right away, because I just think it's so much fun to actually see your app out in the wild, and that gives me a ton of motivation to continue on, which is why I often like to deploy my projects as early as possible. So in this cast, we're going to prepare our first deployment so that we in the next cast actually can do the deployment and try our app out in the Chrome browser. As you can see on the left-hand side here, I've added a couple of new files, namely the icon.png. That's just a PNG image, which looks like this little icon right here. Pretty suitable for our app with this $sign as our sales representatives are to be reminded that this app will bring in more dollars for their commissions. Also, you'll see a manifest.json file at the bottom here. And you might wonder, well, what is JSON? I've never seen that before. And you're right, we haven't talked about that earlier, but don't worry, it's nothing dangerous. JSON is short for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a way for us developers to store and send data. And it's often used when you, for example, want to send a piece of data from a server to a client, that is, to a browser. And in our case, we are using this manifest.json file to configure our app and to provide metadata about it. So Google Chrome will read through this and look at the name. Oh, it's called Leads Tracker. Well, then Google Chrome will give our app the name Leads Tracker. It'll also see that the version is 1.0, so that the next time we deploy and we change this to, for example, 1.1, it'll know that, oh, we have updated our version. And that's information that's definitely useful to know for Google Chrome. One thing you might wonder here is why these key value pairs, as you can see, which you hopefully recognize from JavaScript objects, have keys that are wrapped in quotes, because if you remember from when we worked with JavaScript objects previously, we didn't use quotes around our keys, but that's something you have to do when writing JSON. So don't be tempted to think that this actually is a JavaScript object right now. It's not, it's just plain text, but it's using the JavaScript object notation. So it's mimicking a JavaScript object, and you later learn how to turn a JSON object into a JavaScript object. If this is a little bit confusing, don't worry about it. It'll sort itself out as we look more into this. Let's just move on and look at the two final key value pairs here. We have manifest version. That's just telling Chrome which version of this JSON file we are using. There used to be a version number 1 that people used, and then there was a version number 2, but now we have a version number 3. So that's version number 3. And finally, there's the action. And that's kind of the meat of our application. It configures what happens when the user clicks on our application from the Google Chrome extensions toolbar. Let me show you that. Here we have Twitter. And if I click on the extensions button up here in the top right corner, this little puzzle piece, you can see it opens up all of my extensions. And when I click at, for example, Grammarly for Chrome, it opens up the Grammarly extension. And as you can see, it uses a little icon here as well. So in the action, the default icon that you provide, this icon PNG here, which points to this image file we've provided, will pop up here besides this puzzle piece button. And also the default pop-up, the index.html that we provide inside of our action, well, it's our pop-up. And in our case, it'll simply be the HTML we have been building all along. Now, there's one thing we need to fix, which is that a Chrome extension will only be as wide as it needs to be. And strictly speaking, our app doesn't need to be any wider than this, because that's the width our button needs. So we need to set a min width on the index.css. And I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Min width of 400 pixels, for example. Now you can see if we go below 400 pixels, our input field is now outside of the app. So Google Chrome will understand that we don't want that. We want our app to be like this. This is the minimum size. So now we finally have everything in place. Your next step is to download this code. You do that by clicking on the settings icon in the bottom right corner and download as zip. That'll download the zipped folder. You can then open that zipped folder, for example, in your dev directory, and call it whatever you want. Here you can see all of the files that you recognize, along with a README file, which you can safely ignore or delete. That's up to you. And when you have that, we are ready to deploy our Chrome extension. So let's just move on to the next cast to do exactly that. Okay, it is time to deploy our application. And I'm so excited about this because I just love seeing products move out into the world and start solving problems for people. So let's just jump into this. The first thing you need to do is to head over to Chrome-//extensions. That'll bring up this UI you can see right here, which lists out all of your extensions. Now, this address here is a little bit funky, so you can just copy it from the file right here and paste it into your address bar if you want to do that. And once you're there, I want you to trigger the developer mode on. So just click up here in the top right corner, and then you'll see these three buttons appear: load unpacked, pack extension, and update. And you are going to load an unpacked extension. So click that button. That'll bring up the file chooser menu. There you are to navigate to the leads tracker folder that we downloaded from Scrimba in the previous cast. Choose that folder and hit select. And once you've done that, boom, your lead tracker is now in the extensions interface. And actually, that's it. Now, if we open up another tab, for example, I'll open up the LinkedIn profile of Frode, one of the co-founders of Scrimba, and then I can click on the puzzle icon here in the top right corner. That'll bring up all my extensions, and there we can see our lead tracker. That is just so cool. You can see the little icon here, and if we click it, it brings up the user interface for our app. So that is amazing. Now I can, for example, write in the URL we're at the moment and hit save input, and there it is saved. So actually now we have something that you can take with you on every website you visit and save information. But our app has a critical flaw. Because if I now close this app, if I click outside of our HTML file and it closes automatically, and then want to open it up again, actually our leads have been deleted, because that's just as if we were saving something to the input here, and then seeing it in the list, and then refreshing the page, and boom, it's gone again. So every time we open up our Chrome extension, it's a full refresh. So we need to learn how we can store data across page refreshes. How do we do that? That's not something you've learned yet, but it's not that hard. So over the next few casts, I'm going to teach you exactly that so that our app becomes truly useful for salespeople who need to traverse the web and gather leads. So let's just move on and get that sorted out. Database that we can use. So let's try to do that. If we hit on the console tab, and open up the console, which you've previously seen, and then type in, for example, local storage.clear and open and close parentheses to call that function, and then navigate back to the application tab, you can see that we have cleared out all of the key value pairs in our local storage. So we were able to interact with these values using JavaScript. Going back to the console, we can yet again, for example, do local storage.setItem and then pass in first my leads as a string and then comma. And then I'm going to pass in the string of the URL that we visited previously, that is Froda's LinkedIn profile, and then hit enter. If we now go back to application again, you can see that we have a key value pair in our local storage. The key is my leads, and the value is the URL to Froda's LinkedIn profile. And what's so cool about this, if I now try to hit the refresh button, what you'll see is that yet again, Wikipedia adds back these three key value pairs, but the my leads key and its value persists. And that is exactly the feature we're looking for. Persisting data across page refreshes. So with this in mind, let's move on and try to interact with the local storage from our index.js file in the next cast. So I'll see you there. So now we are going to use local storage in our app. And we do that in the exact same way as we did it using the console on wikipedia.org. However, we're writing it in our JavaScript file. That means that we can simply use the local storage variable. That is accessible in the so-called global scope. So when you're running JavaScript in a browser, you have access to this variable wherever you are. We'll then do set item, open and close parentheses, and then we'll first write the name of our item. We'll call it my leads. Then we'll specify the value. Here I'll just do example lead.com. So this is the key and this is the value. If I now run this code, nothing seems to have happened, but if we actually delete this entire line and even rerun the browser again so that we know that the only way to get a hold of that data would be if it is persisted in local storage, and then try to do exactly that by doing local storage.getItem, passing in the name of our item, the key, and that was my leads, and then we console log that out. Running the code, here we go. ExampleLead.com is logged to the console because our browser remembers that we previously saved a lead under this name, and now we can get it. That is pretty cool. It opens up so many possibilities. Now I want you to try this. You're going to solve a 3-part challenge. First, you are to save a key value pair in local storage in the exact same way as I did, and then you are to refresh the page, and then get the value and log it out to the console. Finally, I want you to clear out the local storage as well. And as a little hint, I have added the 3 methods you are to use down here. Local storage.setItem, passing in key and value. GetItem, passing in key. And clear, which clears out the entire local storage. So you need to use all of these 3. And one little gotcha before you take a stab at this. Both the key and the value that you pass in here and here need to be strings. That's a limitation with local storage, meaning you can only store strings. So it is a very primitive database, but it's what we got. So give this your best shot and then return back to the screencast if you want to see me do it yet again. Okay, let's do this. First, we do local storage.setItem. I'm going to call this one my name and set it to Per Harold Borgen, like that. I'm going to run the code so that now, hopefully, this has been saved, meaning I can actually comment it out because we don't need it anymore. Now I can do local storage.getItem and then pass in my name like that. Actually, I'm going to store this in a variable called name, just as a little bonus here. And then console log out the name instead of just console logging out this expression. When we run this, you can see, yes, we are logging out my name. Good stuff. Let's move on to the final part of the challenge. I'm going to comment this out, and then I'm going to do local storage dot clear. Now, if I run the code, apparently nothing has happened, but if we now comment these 2 lines again and run it, oh, null. So my name no longer exists. Well, that's great, because that's exactly what we try to do by clearing out local storage here on line 11. So as far as I can see, local storage really seems to do the job. Let's move on and learn how to use this properly with our myLeads array so that it's implemented into our app and gives us that ever so important persistence feature for our leads. Now, there is one issue with storing our leads in local storage as an array. And that's something we'd be aware about if we, for example, were to head over to Mozilla Developer Docs to read a little bit about local storage. Here you can see the window.localstorage page. The reason it says window here is because local storage actually exists on this window object. But you can also use the local storage variable directly. And when writing code in general, I would say that less is more. So that if I can write less code, I will do that. So that's why I'm omitting the window dot syntax. Anyway, here we can read that the local storage read-only property of the window interface allows you to access a storage object for the document's origin. Oh my god, that's just really complicated in my view, especially for a beginner. So let's scroll a bit down and read about what it actually does down in the description. The keys and the values stored with local storage are always in the UTF-16 DOM string format. What the hell does that mean? I mean, UTF-16 DOM string? That is some hardcore stuff, but we are not going to worry about all that. The only thing that matters is string. We at least know what that is. And as you can see here, as with objects, integer keys are automatically converted to strings. Okay, so it seems like actually everything that is stored inside of local storage has to be strings. Well, that's a problem because we were expecting to store this array here. So how do we do this? Well, to get someone to explain this to us in an easier way, I would just Google out our problem, store array in local storage, and look for the first Stack Overflow question. How do I store an array in local storage? Okay, that's our problem as well. And instead of fine reading the question, I just jump to the answer immediately because I'm impatient. And there you can see a very straightforward explanation. Local storage only supports strings. Use json.stringify and json.parse. Okay, here we can see some code. And we recognize this local storage.set item and then passing in the key. And then instead of just passing in the value, which here should be the names array, they are doing json.stringify and passing in the names array in that. So it seems as if this json.stringify takes the array and turns it into a string. And likewise, on the other side, when they are to fetch data from local storage, they use local storage.getItemNames, but then wrapping that entire expression into json.parse. So that seems to go the other way around, from string to array. Okay, so actually, let's just try this. Let's pretend that this is our array in local storage. We have one lead here. And as we read in local storage, everything is strings. So we have to turn this into a string, and we can use that with the backticks like that. Now, this is a string. And the problem here would be that, let's say that we fetch this from local storage and we want to push another lead to the array. And we try to do that with myleads.push epiclead.com. From this, we get an error. myleads.push is not a function. That is because the push method doesn't exist on strings. It only exists as a method you can use on arrays. So what we then have to do first, here we've gotten the data from local storage. Now we need to do what our friend over at Stack Overflow did, which was to parse the entire thing. So we can do myLeads equals json.parse and then pass in myLeads here. Now, after we push, log out myLeads, run it. Yes, now we can see, now it worked. How about if we wanted to go the other way around? This here, where we're actually stringifying the array so that we can save it in local storage. Well, this will be this situation here, we do myLeads equals json.stringify, and then passing in myLeads. We now run this code. In the console, it kind of looks like an array, so maybe not the best example, but what we can do here is we can do type of before myLeads. Then we'll ask JavaScript to tell us which type is this variable here. If we run this, you can see we get string. So by using the so-called JSON methods, that is the stringify and the parse, and passing in our data, we can flip back and forth between strings and arrays. And also, obviously, if we used a JSON object like this with the curly brackets, it would turn it into a JavaScript object and the other way around. And that's actually a more common use case. But in our case, we have an array to work with, and it does the job perfectly well for arrays as well. Okay, now it's your turn to practice. I'm going to turn this back into a string and give you a set of instructions. Okay, you are going to do these 4 steps. First, turn the myLeads string into an array, then push a new value to that array, then turn the array into a string again, and finally, console log the string using the typeof that you just learned to verify that it's actually a string. So go ahead and give this a shot right now. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do this. First, we'll do myLeads equals JSON parse, passing in myLeads. That should turn it into a proper array again. Now that we have it as an array, we can do myLeads.push youtube.com. Okay, we have to turn it into a string again. We do myLeads, reassigning it to json.stringify myLeads. And finally, console log out type of myLeads. Run the code, and we get string in our console, just as we wanted. We have gone from string to array back to string again. Great job. Now you are going to implement the first part of our local storage feature, and that consists of saving the myLeads array to local storage. So that should happen here on line 11, right after you've pushed the new lead to the myLeads array and cleared out the input field, then we are ready to actually save it to local storage. And you have to remember to use the json.stringify when saving it, even though the browser we're using might be kind to us and actually do this for us if it notices that we haven't done it. We want to be explicit about this so that we remind ourselves that we know the difference between working with just plain text or a proper JavaScript array. So remember to do that, and once you've written your solution, you should run the code by filling out the input field and hitting the Save Input button, because this line at the bottom of the function will also be run, and it heads into local storage and gets the item that is called myLeads. So if your implementation has worked, this console log should log out whatever you've saved to local storage as well, because myLeads is actually the key we want to use in order to save our array. So use this as the key. So go ahead and do this, and I will of course show you the solution when we return back to this cast. Okay, let's do this. First we'll do local storage dot set item, and here we first need to specify what key we want to save our item under, and that is, as I said here, myLeads. So we'll do myLeads, and then a comma, and then what we actually want to save. Now you might have been tempted to simply do myLeads like that, grabbing the variable called myLeads. But as I said, we need to use JSON stringify to turn this into a text string. So we'll do json.stringify and wrap the array inside of the parentheses of the stringify method. There we have it. Let's run the code. Try to add a lead, hit save input, and there we go. As you can see in the console, we are indeed logging out something that looks very much like an array with one item of awesome lead, which is exactly what we wanted. Great job, let's move on. So now we are able to set items in local storage, aka we are saving leads to local storage so that we can, for example, do awesome lead and epic lead and then see that yes, they are indeed logged out because we have fetched the item from local storage here. And actually, you can even open up the developer tools here on Scrimba and click down to cw0.scrimba.com, and there you will see my leads as the key and the values as well. And the reason it's cw0.scrimba.com is because that's actually the domain for this mini browser under the hood. However, that's Scrimba magic. Don't worry about that right now. Just know that you can access it by choosing that domain. Now, there's one big problem here though, which is that if we now refresh this page again, boom, our leads are gone. Or actually, they're not gone. They still exist down in local storage. However, we haven't written the code for heading into local storage, fetching out the leads, and then displaying them when we are refreshing the entire page. We're actually not doing anything. We're just setting the my leads array to an empty array, and we're not even triggering the render leads. So there's multiple things we need to fix up here. But we're going to start small as usual. You are going to basically just try to get the leads from local storage and then store that in a variable, which I would call leads from local storage, and then log out this variable. So now I'm going to close the console. And before you go, I want to remind you about the json.parse method that you learned earlier, because you want to use that to parse the string you get from local storage so that you turn it back into an array. This might be a little bit difficult, but just give it your best shot, and then I will show you how to do it as well. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this. We're going to do more or less the exact same thing we're doing here to begin with, which is basically local storage.get item, passing in my leads. However, we need to parse this. So I'll do json.parse, and then parentheses around this inner expression right here, and then store this in a variable called leads from local storage, like that. Now we can console log out leads from local storage. If we run the code, and you can see there we are logging out the array with the leads that we know that we had here in our local storage. If I now do local storage.clear right above this line and run it, we get null. And now you're probably wondering, well, what the hell does null mean? And as you learn in the next lesson, null is a so-called falsy value that we developers use to signalize emptiness. And here, the developers behind local storage, that is, the people over at Google who have implemented local storage into Chrome, have made it so that it returns null when we ask for a key that doesn't exist. And actually, this is the case for all browsers because they have followed the same specification. However, this means that we'll end up in a situation where this variable, leads from local storage, is either null, which as I said is a falsy value, or it is an array, which is a so-called truthy value. So we're in a situation where we have to act upon a variable that is either truthy or falsy, which is not the same as true and false. Meaning we have to dig deeper into what exactly truthy and falsy means, and we'll do that in the next lesson. Okay, so let's learn about truthy and falsy values. So let's say that we, for example, have a slot machine app. So we have const credits. That's how many credits you as a player have. And then we need to check if credits is more than 0, well, then you're allowed to play the slot machine. So we'll log out let's play with a slot machine emoji. And then else, this means that your credits isn't over 0. So that means that you have to be at 0. Then we'll console log out. Sorry, you have no credits. Like that. Now, if we run this one time, you can see, sorry, you have no credits is logged out because credits was 0. This would evaluate to false, credits is not more than 0, meaning JavaScript would jump to the else clause. However, if we change this to 12, then this expression, 12 greater than 0, would evaluate to true, and this block of code would be run. Now, JavaScript isn't really that strict about what you shove into the condition here. Actually, if we only shoved in credits like that and try to run this again, you can see that we are still logging out let's play. So even though this would be evaluated to 12, when it's shoved into a conditional statement as this, JavaScript will then again translate 12 to true. Likewise, if credits is 0 and we run the code, you can see sorry you have no credits is logged out because this would be translated to 0 first, and then JavaScript would say, oh no, that's a falsy value, so I'm going to translate that to false. So where you before learned about true and false values, you now have to understand truthy and falsy values. Let's try another one. For example, YOLO, just a string. What do you think that will be? When I run this code, what will be logged out? Just take a guess. Okay, let's run it. We can see let's play is logged out. In other words, YOLO, or this string right here, is a truthy value because JavaScript turns this into true in the condition. And as well, if we pass in an array of random items from the code, that is also a truthy value. Okay, let's try another one. Let's do an empty string. Run the code. Oh no, that's a falsy value because it got translated into false, meaning this block of code didn't run. JavaScript jumped to the next block, the else clause, and logged out, sorry, you have no credits. So let's go back to just adding credits here so that our if-else makes sense. And then at this point, you might feel that truthy and falsy values is really complex because how will you keep track of all of these truthy and falsy values? It seems like there's a ton of things to remember. Luckily though, it's not that hard. You essentially have to remember these 6 values. They are the falsy values in JavaScript. False, 0, an empty string, null, undefined, and this weird thing right here, nan, short for not a number. And out in the real world, inside of conditionals, in most cases, you'll work with either false, null, or undefined. So actually, this nan here is rarely ever used, which is why I'm not going to talk anymore about it. Null and undefined, though, deserves a little bit of time, because a lot of developers are confused about these two, and they mix them together. Now, let's look at the similarities first. They are both primitive data types, that just like strings, numbers, and booleans. And they're also both ways to signalize emptiness. However, on a high level, the core difference is that null is how you as a developer signalize emptiness, whereas undefined is how JavaScript signalizes emptiness. So you will use null as a developer. It's a useful tool, whereas undefined is something you'll be exposed to because JavaScript will tell you from time to time that what you're looking for is undefined. Now, let's see this through the lens of an example, as that'll help us see the difference between the two. Like, you'll sometimes see developers declare variables and assign them as null. Let's say you are creating a live streaming app and you have current viewers, and that's set to null, meaning that no people are watching the live streams at the moment. However, a bit later, a few viewers might pop up and you might want to do current viewers equals, and then an array of Jane and Nick, like that. The reason this can be a useful way of describing the situation in terms of how many people who are watching the stream is because you might want to act upon whether or not there are people in the stream. So if current viewers, then you might want to do something. For example, notify the live streamers that people are watching. So go ahead and turn on your live stream. Console log, we have viewers, like that. Now, this block of code will only fire if current viewers has been set to an array. So now you can see it'll be logged out. And let's say a bit later, lose all the viewers, you set it to null. We run the code, nothing happens. Because null is a falsy value, meaning that this will be false, whereas the array here is a truthy value, so when current viewers equals that array, it's set to true, and this block of code is run. Now, here you can see that null is a useful way of signalizing emptiness, because an empty array wouldn't do the trick. If we run this code, you can see we are indeed logging this code because current viewers is an empty array, which then again evaluates to true. So it's better to use null here. That was how you as a developer can signalize emptiness and act upon whether or not a variable is empty. Let's now look at undefined and see how JavaScript uses that to signalize emptiness as well. And we can do that by simply removing everything except let current viewers. If we now try to console log current viewers, which has been declared but not assigned to a value, when we run this, we'll get undefined. So JavaScript tells us that this variable is undefined or kind of like empty. Likewise, if this, for example, was an object and you try to log out a key that doesn't exist, random key using the dot syntax, you'd also get undefined. JavaScript tried to look for this, but it was completely empty. Here, if it is an array with one item, and you try to look for the item at index 5, run this, again, JavaScript says undefined. So this way, when you see either null or undefined in your codebase, it should provide you with a hint as to whether this is JavaScript trying to signalize emptiness, or if there's a developer who's written that code and has tried to signalize emptiness. So that was a long walkthrough of the differences between null and undefined. There's more to it also, but I don't think we need to dig deeper than this. Let's wrap up this cast, and in the next one, I'm going to teach you a neat little trick to check if a value is truthy or falsy, which you can use whenever you are in doubt. Then I'm going to stress test your truthy and falsy skills. So let's move on. If you ever wonder whether a value is truthy or falsy, you can check it through writing boolean, open and close parentheses, and then pass in whatever value you want to check inside of those parentheses. So here we'll do hello. Let's store this in a variable called true or false. Now console log true or false. On the code, you can see that we get true, meaning that hello evaluates to true. Removing the content of the string, running it again, we get false, because as you hopefully remember, an empty string is a falsy value. Now, with this in mind, you are going to do a set of challenges, which I said in the previous cast. Here they are. It's 6 console logs, and inside of them, we are checking a bunch of values for their Boolean value. So each of these lines will log out either true or false, and your job is to here, after these 2 slashes, write either true or false, depending on what you think will be logged out. So go ahead and give this a shot right now. Okay, let's do this. So an empty string, as we remember, that is a falsy value, so this will log false. Here, I'm trying to trick you because 0 is indeed a falsy value, but this is a string which contains 1 character. It's not 0, so this will be true. Here, 100, that's a truthy number. Null, hopefully you remember that that is a falsy value, so this will be false. And here, I'm also trying to trick you. 0 wrapped inside of an array, whilst 0 is a falsy value, an array is a truthy value. So this will be true. Here, minus 0, 0 is a falsy value, and whether it's minus or plus 0 doesn't change that, so this should be false. Let's run the code, and we get false, true, true, false, true, false. Correct. Now we'll return back to the Chrome extension, and you'll use these truthy and falsy skills in order to build a conditional for the leads we have stored or not stored in local storage. So let's move on. So now that we're able to check if we have any leads in our local storage, and if so, we parsed those leads so that we get them as a JavaScript array, we are ready to act upon whatever data we get here. And first, let's then look at what kind of data we can get, because there's essentially 2 situations we need to account for. One is this one right here, where the myArray in local storage gives us back some data, for example, this array right here. If so, we have something to work with, and we can render it out instantly. But then there's the other situation, which is the one right here, where actually there's no data in the myLeads key in local storage, and actually the key doesn't even exist. If so, we know that we get back null. So that is a falsy value, and this is a truthy value. So then the question is, what are we going to do in these two cases? Well, if the value is null, meaning that there's no leads stored in local storage, well, we're not going to do anything, because there's no point trying to render out any leads if there's no leads that are saved there initially. So then we're just going to ignore it, not do anything. But if we find a couple of leads, if we get an array back from this expression right here, then we need to first set myLeads to whatever leads we are returning back, and then call the renderLeads function, because the renderLeads function takes the leads in the myLeads array and renders them out. Because of course, that's what we want to do. We want to show the user whatever we found in local storage. So here is the challenge formulated. First, check if leads from local storage is truthy. That's this variable right here. If so, set the myLeads variable, this one up here, to its value. And by that I mean the value of this variable right here, the leads we have fetched out from local storage. And then call renderLeads. So this might be a little bit of a difficult challenge, but give it your best shot, and then I will show you the solution as well when you return back to this screencast. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do this. We'll do if leads from local storage. That's actually everything we need to do, because this evaluates to either a truthy or a falsy expression. And if it's a truthy, this code will be run. If it's a falsy, then JavaScript will just jump over all of these lines and continue down here on line 16. So inside of here, we are first going to set myLeads to this newly value we've just fetched out. MyLeads equals leads from local storage, and then we are going to render leads like that. If we run this now, you can see nothing happens. That's because at this point, local storage is most likely null. Let's just log it out to verify that. Yes, we're indeed logging out null. What we then can do instead is actually add AwesomeLead and EpicLead to our list. Now both of these should be saved in local storage. We should be in this situation right now. So if I refresh, yes! Now we have persisted our leads across refresh. That is so cool. So give yourself a pat on the back. You should be so proud of yourself reaching this far. You're now working with a small database, basically. And that's a huge step towards becoming a professional developer. Now we need to fix the fact that we can't delete our leads, because obviously that's a feature we need. Let's say that I'm a sales development representative and I'm gathering leads like this. I have 4 leads at this point, and now I want to go ahead and contact these people, or maybe move this data over into a spreadsheet, for example, so that I again can go out to the World Wide Web and churn through leads on LinkedIn and save them to my Chrome extension. Well, then I obviously need to get rid of these existing leads, so that I get a clean slate to start with. But now that's not possible. I can refresh this as many times as I want. It'll just continue to store my leads. So we need a delete button. We need something that looks like this. And that is what you are going to do. In this challenge, you are going to style this delete button. And then later on, we're going to write the code for its functionality as well. But first, we have to create the button in the HTML. And I'm just going to do that for you. So like that. Delete all, and as you can see, if we render this out, you can see that it's actually looking pretty good already. It has the default button styling that we have added in our CSS here, but we want it to be kind of the inverse of the save input button, so that you properly see that it's something different. And in order to target that button, we need to give it an ID of delete-btn, like that. Now, before you start writing your code inside of the delete btn selector right here, I am going to do one change on the button as a whole. Because actually, this button, which you can see in the slide, has slightly different styling than this one here. And that is that the border is actually not none. It's actually 1 pixel, solid, and then this green color, like here. You can see both buttons got 1 pixel added to its border. If I remove this, you'll see that the buttons become slightly smaller. They shrink slightly, like that, with 0. And they become a bit larger if I do 1. And let's just try a different color here. Do red. There you'll clearly see it with 1 pixel and with 0 pixels. We want 1 pixels of the green color because that's needed to get this green border around this delete all button. So now we are ready. You are to style the button according to the provided design, and you're only going to apply the styles inside of this delete BTN ID selector. So go ahead and do this, and then of course I will show you the solution as well when you return back to the screencast. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's start. The first obvious thing is the background. It should be white, not green. So I'll do background white, like that. Okay, now we also seemingly lost the text, but that's not the case. It's just white, so it blends in with the background. So we need to change the color as well. And for that, we're going to use this green color up here and paste it in. And there we go. As easy as that. With that, let's move on. Now we are going to make our delete all button actually work. So you'll do that through a 3-part challenge, pretty big one actually. But first, I'm going to give you a little mini challenge. And that is this leads from local storage here. Should that be defined as a let, or do you think we should change it to a const? Just look at what we're doing with it down here on line 8 and line 9, where we are using it, and take your best guess as to whether we should change it or not. And the answer is that, yeah, actually we do want to change this to a const, because we're not reassigning it here. And if you remember from previously, it's a good practice to, if you can use const, then use const, because it enforces strictness throughout your code base. When another developer comes in here, or you in 2 months, and looks at this leads from local storage and see, oh, it's a const, then I know that this will not be reassigned further down in the code. So that was just a little digression so that we got to clean up this little variable inconsistency here. Now let's move on to the major challenge. As I said, it's 3-part. First, you are going to grab a hold of the delete button and store it in a delete BTN variable. Then you are going to listen for double clicks on the delete button. And if you don't know how to listen for double clicks, you should just Google it. Finally, when the button has been clicked, that is double clicked, you should clear the local storage. You should clear out the myLeads variable, that is this one up here. And you should also clear out the DOM so that the user doesn't see any more leads on this unordered list. So, a pretty big one, but give this one a shot and return back to me when you want to see my solution. Okay, let's do this. I'll start up here. We'll define a const, delete btn like that. Do document dot get element by ID, passing in delete btn. So that is indeed what we had right here. Then let's move on. We are going to listen for double clicks on the delete button. And how do we do that? Well, let's Google it. I think it's a good idea to Google add event listener and then just double click, because as you know, it's the add event listener we are using. By doing this, we get the Mozilla developer docs as the first result. Clicking into that, and I always scroll as fast as I can to the example, as I think it's a lot easier to learn from that rather from textual explanations. Here we can see card.addEventListener DBL click. Pretty nice. So simply delete btn, add event listener, and DBL click, like that. Let's then also do the function. And now let's just console log, double clicked, like that. We'll run the code, double click on delete all, and yes, it worked. If I try a single click, nothing happens. But double click, yes. Okay, good. 3, when clicked, clear local storage, the myLeads variable, and the DOM. Okay, let's do this one by one. Local storage, if you remember, the way to clear that was local storage dot clear. Okay. my leads, how do we clear that one? Well, we actually reassign it by doing my leads and just setting it to an empty array. And then finally, clearing out the DOM. How do we do that? Well, actually, the trick is to simply render out the leads, which now are just an empty array. So we just trigger the render leads function. Render leads, like that. Let's rerun this, and now try to double click on the delete all. Yes! Now we removed everything in the DOM, and we have cleared the local storage. Our array is empty. We have a working delete button. We can delete this console log here. Great job doing this challenge. Let's move on. Now that we have an app that actually works pretty well, we're going to do something we haven't done a lot throughout this course, which is to refactor our code. And not only refactor it based upon a current need, we're going to refactor it based upon a hypothetical future use case. So for this, we're not going to use the mini browser, so I'm just going to minimize that one. And actually, I'm also going to take this function render leads and move it up here right below this conditional, because it is the render leads function we're mainly going to refactor. And the reason for that is the following. This function now currently has a very low degree of what we would call reusability, because here it is hard-coded that whenever it's called, it's always going to look at the myLeads variable, the one we've created up here, our global variable, and render out whatever exists in that array at that point in time. Now, let's say that we one time in the future also have another array. For example, let all leads, perhaps just a bunch of slightly unimportant leads that you've shoved into this array that you don't want to render out at any given time, but you want to perhaps have the opportunity to bring them up from time to time. If so, we would struggle to render them out. Because, as I said, in our render leads function, we only care about the myLeads array. So what we can do instead is to make this function a bit more dynamic and have it render out whatever array we tell it to render out. And the way we do that is to pass in a variable as a so-called argument when we call it. So we could take myLeads here and then pass it in like this in between the parentheses so that it would be possible for us to use it inside of the body of our function, but without referring to myLeads directly like this. Now, let's just pause here for a minute before we rewrite the body of the function, just in case this seems weird, because you might feel you're walking on thin ice here, but actually, you've been passing in arguments into functions when you have called them for quite a while now. Because that is exactly what you're doing up here, for example, the getElementById function, which you are calling and giving it the string of inputl, so that this function, when it does its magic and walks through the HTML file in the search of its element, knows when it hits this point, here it is. This is the element I'm looking for, because Pierre told me so when he wrote this code. He told me that this is indeed the ID he wants. Hadn't we done that, well, the function would have been like blind to whatever it was looking for. Wouldn't be able to recognize this element. But we did, of course, give it that value. And that is also what we're doing here now. We're telling render leads that we want you to render out this data right here. And then to make this work, we also have to here write something like leads inside of the parentheses here as well. The way this works is that when this function is called with this data passed in, this data, this array, will become this variable here, which is accessible inside of the body of the function. So now we can replace myLeads with leads here, and we can replace it here and here. At this point, the body of this function has no idea and no relation to this myLeads global variable up here. It only cares about what you entered into the function when you called it. And now, what actually makes sense is to skip the usage of the word leads in the name of the function, because actually the function at this point doesn't even know that it's rendering out leads. It could be rendering out a bunch of names of soccer teams or a list of fruits or whatever it is. It renders out whatever you pass into it. So actually what we want to do is remove this leads here and simply call it render. Now this of course requires us to do the same thing on the delete button. Here we'll use the new name render, and we have just cleared out the myLeads array, so it's an empty array. So what we'll do is simply pass in myLeads here as well. And finally, on the input button, when we add new leads, we have also modified the myLeads array. So we'll take that and paste it into the parentheses of the function invocation, and then of course use the updated name as well. So now we have a function called render, which can take any array you give it and then render it out. So potentially, you could give it the old leads array as well, and it's a much more dynamic and reusable function. Let's try this. We'll rerun the code. Save awesome lead, epic lead, it works. And yes, the delete button also works. And just as a final notice, it doesn't matter what we call this parameter here. Could have called it YOLO if we wanted. However, that would require us to also change this to YOLO, this to YOLO, and this to YOLO. We run the code, and lead, it works, and we can delete it. It works in the exact same way. However, we actually want to use semantically meaningful names, so let's use leads instead, like that. You're probably a little bit confused right now. That's totally okay. Let's take a closer look at how to use arguments in functions over the next few casts. Okay, let's return back to the example of greeting our users, which we've looked at earlier in the course. So in Scrimba, we have this welcome back Per Harald Borgen text, which is visible on the dashboard. And here I have the basic setup for such a feature using a function. Starting from the top of the file, you can see that we are heading into the DOM and fetching a welcome element. That is the HTML. You can see right here, this paragraph, which is completely empty at the moment. And here in the greet user function, we take that welcome element and we set its text content to welcome back Per Harald Borgen with an emoji at the end. If we run this, nothing happens, of course, because we also have to call the function greet user like that. Now, if we run it, we can see that it is rendered out on the page. And this is a very typical use case for a function, rendering out a specific thing. However, it's a really bad function because it can only render out this string right here. It can only render out my name, which is pretty silly. And it should actually rather be called something like greet Per, but that would just be stupid. We're going to use the greet username and rather modify the function so that it can greet whoever enters the app. And the way to do that is to add a so-called parameter to a function. And I can do that by writing a variable inside of the parentheses of the function declaration. So here, I'll for example write name like that. Now, it is expected that we are to use this name variable inside of the body of the function. And indeed, we are going to do that. We are going to replace this with name like that. So now we are constructing this string using the first string, then the name variable, and then the final string. Now, if we run this code, you'll see welcome back undefined. That is because name is now undefined. And can you take a guess at why? Well, it is because when we call the function, we haven't passed in any names, and our function expected us to do that. So here, in between the parentheses, we'll simply type a name. Let's type Per, for example, run the code, and now you can say welcome back Per. So here, we are passing in a value into the function when we are invoking it. That value becomes the name variable inside of the body of the function, and this is then changed to Per on the fly when it is called. So now I have a challenge for you. You are to give the function a parameter, which you are to call greeting, that replaces the welcome back. So it'll always greet me, but the greeting itself can be howdy or hello or nice to see you or basically whatever, because you will define it as a parameter in the function, and then you of course will call it with a value so that you verify for yourself that it actually works. Go ahead and give this a shot. Okay, hopefully that went well. The way to do this is by doing greeting here, and then removing this, but rather writing greeting here, and then a plus. And here, when we call it, we can do howdy, and run the code, and there you can see howdy Per Harald Borgen. Great job, let's move on. Okay, so our function is now pretty dynamic since it can use whatever greeting value you want. So you can kind of set the tone however you want when calling the function. But we need to get back the same type of feature for the name as well. So the way we can do that is by adding a second parameter, because you can have as many parameters as you want. So actually here I can do name and then replace this with a name like that. Now, if we run this, you'll see howdy undefined again, because we've only given this function one argument when we called it, but actually it expects two, both the greeting and the name. So here we have to do comma and then James, for example. We run the code now, you can see howdy James. So now we have a really dynamic function here. So it's a pretty good function in my opinion, but there's one issue which is not related to parameters, but related to the code quality of the function body. Because as you can see, while it made sense to use double quotes for strings when we started out, at this point the expression has become a little bit clunky. We have 3 plus signs here, and we might even get more of them as we continue on improving this function. So at this point, it's time to refactor this expression into using template literals. So I want you to do that now, and then we are ready to add a third parameter to our function. So go ahead and change this into template literals right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. The way to do it would be to add a template literal to begin with, and then want to end the string. Then now we can remove all of these clunky plus signs and quotes. And here we have 2 variables, greeting and name, which we need to escape out from the string. So we'll do $, open curly bracket, closing curly bracket, $, open, and close. Yes, this looks better, much more readable. If we run it again, you see we get the exact same result. Great job. And your job now is to add the ability to choose the emoji as well. Meaning you should be able to run the function and pass in a third parameter which decides what kind of emoji that will be rendered to the page. So go ahead and try that right now. Okay, the way to do it would be the same as we've done up until now, by adding a third parameter here, emoji, and then replacing this hard-coded emoji with that variable escaped out from the string, of course, emoji like that. And here we'll need to also now add an emoji when we are calling the function. Let's try the fire one, run the code, and nice! We now have a super dynamic function that we can use to create greetings of all sorts, and it's so much better than what we started out with. Let's move on. Okay, up until now, we've only passed in strings as arguments in our functions. However, you can of course pass in whatever data type you want. For example, numbers. And I want you to practice that now. So I'm going to give you a challenge where you are to use numbers in a function that you have written from scratch. So here you have to combine what you've previously learned about functions and arguments and see if you can connect the dots together. So you are going to create a function called add that simply adds 2 numbers together and returns the sum. So down here on line 5 and 6, I'm calling this function and then logging it out. I'm doing that 2 times, and the first time the number 7 should be logged out, and the second time the number 111 should be logged out, because I've passed in 3 and 4 the first time around, and 9 and 102 the second time around. So these are basically your test cases. So go ahead and write this function here on line 3. It should have 2 parameters and should return the sum of those 2 parameters. And then afterwards, I will of course show you the solution as well. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do this. We'll do function, add, open and close parentheses, and then the square brackets. And inside of the parentheses, we need to define our two parameters. I would call the first one num1 and the second one num2. And here, I'm just going to return num1 plus num2, like that. If we now run this, we can see in our console we are logging out 7 and 111. Great job, let's move on. Okay, up until now, you've heard me say the words parameter when I've talked about defining variables in between the parentheses when we declare a function, and I've also said arguments when we pass in values into the function when we invoke the function. And this is probably a little bit confusing. Like, why am I using two different words? They're basically the same thing. And actually, to be honest, in my experience, most developers mix up the words parameter and arguments all the time. And that's totally okay. Even I, actually, up until this point, when I decided to actually explain the difference in this course, would mix the two up all the time. Meaning, mixing up these here values that you pass in when you call the function and these variables that you define when you write the original function. So the way it works is that these are parameters and these are arguments. And in order to remember the difference between these two, I found a really cool comic on the web which pictures two people arguing in a bar and then a bouncer coming to say, hey, take your argument outside. And that gives us the hint. Arguments are created on the outside of the function, whereas parameters then naturally have to be on the inside of the function. So greeting and name, as you know, are only defined here on the inside of the function, but Howdy and James, they come from kind of the outside of the function, the outer scope. This would perhaps be even more clear if we had a variable here which was called hi, and we set it to Howdy like that, and then we pass in hi here. Surely this hi variable is on the outside of the function, because in this case that is this function, lines 2 to 4. This is on line 7 and line 8, so they are on the outside. Likewise here, num1 and num2 are the parameters, whereas 3 and 4 are the arguments. So with this, I want you to answer these 4 questions with either arguments or parameters. So the answer is one or the other, and you are to write that here after the question mark. So go ahead and do this right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. What are greeting and name? Greeting and name, well, that is on the inside of the function. That means that they are parameters. About Howdy and James, well, as we've talked about, these live on the outside. When you're outside of the function, you are an argument, so they are arguments. How about num1 and num2? Okay, these are defined in the function declaration and live in the inside of the function, meaning they are parameters. 3 and 4 are on the outside of this function here, so they are arguments, like that. So from now on, whenever you wonder whether you should say parameter or argument, just think about this epic cartoon created by Type Alias and actually consider clicking on this link so that you get to check out the blog post, which is really good. And then, to be honest, you will probably meet a lot of professional developers who can't even remember this difference, but you will. So far, we've only passed in numbers and strings into functions that we've practiced with in this little mini section on function parameters. However, you can pass whatever variable you want, actually, into a function as its parameter. So now I want you to create a function which is called getFirst, and it takes an array as its only parameter. That's why I'm writing it as ARR. And this function, when called, should return the first item in the array. So I want you to create this function and make it return the first item. And then I want you to call it, passing in an array as an argument so that you verify that it works. And you can do that by using, for example, console log to verify it. I'm not going to give you any starter code here. You got to write the entire thing because that helps you get the muscle memory. So go ahead and give this a shot right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries. Let's do this. We'll do get first, like that, r, and then the body of the function. Then we need to take this r variable and return the first item. We do return r, open and close square brackets, and 0 inside of it. Now we can do get first, open parentheses, and pass in an array. Let's say this was a blackjack game, so we're passing in the values of my cards, like that. If we run this, nothing seemingly will happen since we've only returned this value. We haven't logged it out. Let's actually return it and store that value in a first card variable and then console log out first card. If we run this, first card is console logged as 10, and that is indeed correct. Great job. We are back at our Leads Tracker app, and now you are going to do what I did previously, which was to refactor the render leads function so that it takes a parameter, which I suggest you should call leads, that it uses instead of the global myLeads variable, this one right here. So hopefully you remember how I did this or are able to wing it on your own. Anyway, please also remember to update all of the function invocations across the file as well. It is a good idea to update the name as well, but it's not strictly needed, so I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not you want to do that. Just go ahead and give this a shot right now. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do this. So we are going to create this function so that it rather takes in a parameter here, which we're calling leads, instead of referring to the global myLeads variable. So then we simply need to replace myLeads with what we've called our parameter, like this in these 3 places. And that's it. I also want to remove leads from the name and then go up here, change the name, and also pass in the myLeads variable. Do the same thing here. We've cleared out the myLeads variable, pass in myLeads, which now is just an empty array. And finally, down here, pass in myLeads, like that. Let's run this to verify that it works. Save input, delete all. Yes, great job. Let's move on. In this challenge, we are going to set the stage for the Save Tab button. I'm going to write the HTML for you first, and then you are going to take over and do the JavaScript part of it. So we do a button like that. It should be called Save Tab. We run this. We can see that we get the Save Tab button, and let's give it an ID of tab-btn, like that. Now, you are first going to grab the Save Tab button and then store it in a tab-btn variable. And then you are going to hook up an event listener with this button so that you listen for clicks. And when it's clicked, you are to log out my LinkedIn URL to the console. And the way you grab a hold of that LinkedIn URL is through navigating into this tabs array that actually has an object as its only item. And that object has a key value pair of URL and the actual string value of the URL to my LinkedIn profile. So this might sound a little bit weird, like why am I forcing you to do all this complex stuff of navigating into this array and into this object and fetching out this value right here? Well, you'll understand this when we implement this with the Chrome API that actually gives us access to the current tab we're on at any given point, because then we actually have to do such a navigation. So I'm just prepping you for that. So you have to remember how to work with arrays and objects. That's great to get some practice on. If you struggle, I will of course show you the solution as well afterwards. So go ahead now and just give this your best shot. Okay, hopefully this went well. Let's do this. We'll create a const tab-btn and use document.getElementById, passing in tab-btn, as that is the ID. We gave it over in the HTML, yes. Down here, we need to listen for button clicks on the tab-btn. We'll do add event listener. First argument is click. Second is a function that will be run when the button is clicked. And here, let's console log out just this entire expression. when you are to navigate into complex expressions like this, it's often a good idea to just take one step at a time and log out the results. Let's run this, hit the Save tab, and bring up the console. Okay, we can see now that we have our URL wrapped inside of both square brackets and curly brackets. One thing we at least need to do is navigate into the first item of this array right here. And how do we navigate into the first item, which also happens to be the only item? Well, we simply do square brackets 0 for the 0th index. Let's run this, hit Save tab, and there we can see in our console, we're now just logging out an object. So this is an object with a key, URL, and the value, which points to my LinkedIn profile. How do we get a hold of that value? Well, we use the dot notation, .url, like that. Run the code again, hit Save tab, and there we go. We have logged out my LinkedIn URL. Great job. Let's move on. Next step is to actually save the URL instead of just logging it out, because obviously this doesn't do the trick for our app. We need to save it to local storage, we need to add it to the My Leads array, and we also need to trigger a render so that the fictional lead here actually will be rendered on the page when the user hits the tab button. So to achieve this, you basically need to do more or less the same thing that you're doing inside of the input button. So hopefully you've got this. If not, no worries. I will of course show you the solution when you return back to this screencast. Okay, let's do this. So the first thing I want to do is push it to the My Leads array. So we'll do my leads.push and then pass in this expression right here, like that. Let's comment out this one for now. Next up, we need to save the My Leads array to local storage. Luckily though, we know how to do this. That's the exact same line as we have down here. Local storage.set item. The My Leads, which is the key, should be set to the stringified version of the My Leads array. So let's just remember how this looks and rewrite it up here. I want to rewrite it because it's a little bit of a complex expression, so it's good to get that practice. Local storage set item. Which item? Well, it's the My Leads key, which is what it's called. And here we are going to set it to the My Leads value. However, we need to stringify this value first. So we'll do json.stringify, open parentheses, close parentheses, and a lot of spaces here so that you understand what happens. This is the array, and this is the stringified version of that array. So the array turned into a string. We can do it like this, I think. Okay, looking pretty good. Now, final thing we need to do is actually trigger a re-render. Because we have pushed something to the My Leads array, now we want to render it out with the render function and pass in My Leads as the argument so that we actually get to see it on our page. I'll run this code, bring up the mini browser and hit the Save tab, and there you go. We got our URL rendered to the page. Let's combine it with a lead as well. Awesome lead. Yeah, there we go. And delete all. Ooh, nice. It works. Really good job. So we now have a working dummy version of our tab button. However, it's kind of useless because if I hit the Save tab here once, twice, 3 times, you can see we're just rendering out our hard-coded tab URL, which we have here. So what we of course rather want to do is the following. We want to be able to open up our Chrome extension on any URL, and then when we hit the Save tab button, the extension should head over to the address bar here, grab a hold of this URL, and then boom, save it in our list of leads. So my question for you here is, where in our code, that is on which line, should we go ahead and try to talk with the Chrome API to ask it for the current tab URL? Just take a guess at where in this file we need to do that. Well, the place we want to do it is right here. When the user has clicked on the tab button and this function has been triggered, here on line 20, we want to grab the URL of the current tab. Basically, what we are doing here, but we want to do it in the real world, not just using the made-up hard-coded array I've written up here on line 14. So then the question is, well, how do we ask the Chrome browser for this URL? And yet again, we will resort to Google. We'll simply write Chrome extension get current tab. That gives us a bunch of results. And on first place, you can see the developer.chrome.com, so the documentation. If we head into that, you will see chrome.tabs. Okay, description. Use the chrome.tabs API to interact with the browser's tab system. Sounds about right. If we scroll a bit down, we'll see manifest. So it turns out that we have to do some changes on our manifest file. Namely, we have to add this permissions and then fill in tabs. Okay, that's fine, but not really what we're looking for. We're looking for the JavaScript code in order to actually grab a hold of the tab URL itself. If we continue scrolling down, we get to this really discouraging list of a bunch of methods of this API. And this is so typical. When you're searching through documentation, it's very often difficult to find the answer as a beginner. So actually, what I would do is go back to the results we got on google.com, because there we can find a Stack Overflow question that looks much more humanly understandable. How can I get the current tab URL for a Chrome extension? Okay, let's click into that one. You can see there's a person that has a problem that looks like ours, and that person has even provided some code of how they're trying to solve this today. Chrome.tabs.getSelected. Let's scroll a bit down and find an answer, because that's normally where we find a piece of code we can use. So here you can see, just an FYI for your info for people from Google, the method the original poster uses is deprecated. Okay, to get the tab the user is viewing and only in the window they are viewing, use this. Chrome.tabs.query. Okay, and then we pass it in an object with some data and we get this function with tabs and a lot of code. But actually, it looks very promising. So what I'll do then is what all developers do almost every single day, which is to copy code directly from Stack Overflow. So I'll copy this and just paste it in here, because this is where we want to talk with the Chrome API. I'm going to remove this comment. And now we suddenly have this hairy, strange-looking code, which we haven't written. That's not comfortable. And we can also see that it's not following our conventions for writing code. For example, it uses semicolons, which we don't like that. And it also uses the var keyword, which we don't use either. It's the old way of writing variables in JavaScript. We want to replace that with let or const. Now I'm just going to use let, as I'm not really sure what the point with these variables is at this point. I just want to clean it up. And storing them as let variables will definitely work. So let's just do that. However, now that we at least have the code according to our conventions, it's time to break this down and really understand it. And we'll do that in the next cast. Okay, now that we have this little snippet of code which we copied from Stack Overflow, it would be really tempting to actually try to run it and just console log out tabs at this point, for example, just to figure out what's going on here after this function is being triggered. But actually, if we try to do that, run this code, hit the save tab, we'll see that we get an error. Cannot read property query of undefined. That's because Chrome.tabs, that's a so-called API, application programming interface. Sounds really scary, I know, but don't worry about that now. All I wanted to say is that this is an API that is only available to us when we're running the code in the context of a Chrome extension, like this, which you can see here. Now we are running the code in the context of this Scrimba mini browser here, and we don't have access to the Chrome.tabs, meaning it's undefined, as our error message is saying, because it's trying to read the property query of something that is undefined. So we actually just have to try to make sense of this code and try to configure it how we think it should be, and then deploy it to see if it works out in the wild. So what I'm going to do, I'll delete this console log tabs, and actually I want to delete everything inside of this function, because we are going to figure out what we will do inside of this function on our own by looking back at Stack Overflow. And also, I actually want to comment out these lines of code, because while it's okay to copy to get it into the code base, I want to write it with you to break it down step by step so that you understand it properly. So with this in the background, let's rewrite it and see if we can make sense of it. So the first thing we write is Chrome, which is a variable that we'll have access to when we are running the Chrome extension. And that is an object, and it has a tabs key, and the tabs, that is an object as well, and that object has a query method, like that. So here we're kind of saying, hey Chrome, I want to grab a hold of your tabs, or more specifically, I want to query you for some of the tabs. Well, then which tabs is the next question, and we'll specify that inside of the query using an object. To begin with, I'm going to say, well, I want the active tab. As I'm specifying, active has to be true. And which tab is that? Well, if we look back at our slide here, you can see that in this situation, we have one browser window that has 3 tabs, but it's the LinkedIn tab that is the active one. So it will give us this tab. However, here we can also say that we ought to specify current window to be true as well, which is a little bit weird. What does that mean? Well, imagine this case. If you actually had another browser window in the background, well, the Chrome API would know about this. So naturally, you'd have to specify, well, which one of the 2 windows are you looking for? And in this case, the active window is the one in the front right here. And that is where the LinkedIn tab is located, where we have our Chrome extension open. Also, we have to specify, well, current window. So we need that to be true as well. So here we are calling the query method and passing in an object that describes which of the tabs we want. And then, as we did up here, where we start with a specification and then write a function as the second argument, we'll do the exact same thing in the query function as well. We'll write function like that. And this function will be triggered when Chrome has found the tab we have told Chrome to look for. And when Chrome triggers this function, it'll give us a tabs variable like this. It's a parameter in this function. So now we would get access to the tabs. And this console log would work if we were running this in the context of a Chrome extension. Let's now bring down the console, break this up a little bit, because the question is here, what do we want to do inside of this function? Well, it's through this tabs keyword here that we will actually get a hold of the URL, the string in the address bar. So it's inside of here that we actually have to push to our myLeads array, save to local storage, and call the render function. So I'm actually going to copy this code and paste it in here, like that. And now the question is, well, what does this tabs variable include? How do we navigate to the URL value inside of this variable? Well, it just so happens to be that it's constructed in this exact way. And how did I know that? Well, because here on Stack Overflow on our question, we could see that on the question below that a person got it to work by doing var tab equals tabs 0, which is exactly what we're doing here. And then on the next line, it did tab.url, which essentially is our .url here. So it turns out that this is the way to get a hold of the URL. But at this point, there's a little problem. Since we have defined tabs here and also up here, these 2 variables will be in conflict with each other. And obviously, we don't need this hard-coded variable anymore. We want to use whatever value we get directly from Chrome. So we can keep this and just leave this how it is. Now, let's clean up this a little bit. And then finally, head over to manifest.json, because we saw in the Chrome extensions documentation that we had to add the following to our manifest file. So permissions, and then that is an array, and here we specify tabs. So now we are telling Chrome that we want to be able to work with the tabs in the Chrome extension. Otherwise, this chrome.tabs simply wouldn't work. So in the next cast, we'll go ahead and deploy this so that we finally get to try our entire application out in the wild. So let's deploy the final version of our app. First, you of course have to download the zip from this scrim, and you can do that by clicking on the settings icon in the bottom right corner and then download as zip, which we did the last time around as well. And then make sure that you take these files and update update the lead tracker folder that we also created in a previous cast. Or if you have been working locally alongside me, you of course can skip this step. But what's important is that the same folder gets the new updated files. Because then we head over to the Chrome/extensions page. There we can see our lead tracker from previously. I'm going to hit details so that we open up the page for our extension. And there you can hit update. By doing that, Chrome will grab a hold of the new files and update your extension. Once that's done, we can open up a new tab, for example, and head over to a lead we want to track. Here I've opened up Scrimba's CTO's GitHub profile. That's Sindre. Let's say we want to track this URL as a lead. Then I'll hit the Chrome extension button. I'll choose my leads tracker. And here I can try Save Tab, and boom, our Chrome extension headed over to a tab, grabbed the URL, and displayed it for us. That's awesome. We can also try our input field by just passing in a random lead, hit the save input, and there we go. It was placed here below the URL to Sindra's GitHub profile. So far, so good. Let's open up a whole new tab now. For example, Leanne's LinkedIn profile. You probably recognize Leanne from the Scrimba community, as she is our community manager. Let's open up the Chrome extension again and try the Save Tab button. Yes, it worked. Really good. Now, the final button to try is the Delete All, and I'll hit that, and there you go. We have deleted all of our leads. This is so cool. We've now created a real-world product that can give value to sales development representatives, or basically any person collecting leads online, which is an activity that people in almost all companies do. So we have really created something of value that you can share with the world. So your JavaScript skills are starting to become dangerous. Congratulations, you have reached the end of this section and actually built your own browser extension. How cool is that? You should be goddamn proud of yourself for achieving that. And just enjoy the fact that you've learned all of these awesome concepts that we now are going to recap. So, what did we learn? Well, we started out with the const variable. That is a critical part of JavaScript, and as you can see, once we learned it, we started using it much more than we used let. For all of these DOM elements that we stored in variables, we used const, as we were not going to reassign these. And speaking of DOM, we learned a lot of new things about the document object model. First and foremost, the add event listener. Down here at line 14, we hooked up an event listener with the tab button, for example. This gave us the benefit of not having to write the event listeners in our HTML. We controlled everything in the JavaScript file. And then also we learned about inner HTML. Down here at line 33, we had to use this because the .text content property just didn't do the trick when we wanted to render out list items like this. And finally, we also learned input value, which is another part of working with the DOM. And that was down here when we fetched out the value which the user had entered into the input field. Another thing we did is take one more step into the world of functions, namely we learned about parameters, which is what we defined here. We defined a leads parameter in the render function, and that gave us the ability to use this variable inside the body of the function, and also it required us to pass in the argument of myLeads when we invoked this function. This is a crucial concept to understand if you are to make functions really reusable. So I'm really happy that we went through this. Next up, a super cool thing we also learned was template strings, because that gave us the ability to write strings on multiple lines, which looks much better. It's easier for humans to parse. And also we could use this $sign and square brackets in order to escape out of the string instead of having to use these plus signs, which quickly became unmaintainable and confusing to work with. And then a super cool thing we learned was local storage. Here we saved things in local storage so that we could work across page refresh. This is kind of your first exposure to a database. A very simple database, of course, but still very much the same concept. And that forced us also to learn about JSON, which is a very common way of storing data in web development. You were forced to deal with this since you had to turn our array into a JSON array using JSON.stringify, and also we had to use JSON.parse to go the other way around. When we fetched a string from local storage, and that string just happened to be a JSON array, and we could parse it and turn it into a JavaScript array using the JSON.parse. Don't worry if you are confused about JSON parse and JSON stringify. It's totally okay to search for which one does what every single time you do it. I've done it again and again and again. But JSON is core. And one testament of that is the fact that you were exposed to JSON also in another way, namely with the manifest.json file. Here we had to configure our app, and I'm actually glad that the Chrome extension required this, because you will see JSON in many different scenarios as you work as a web developer. Finally, one of the last things we looked into was objects in arrays. Namely, this tabs array here, where you actually had an array where its first and only item was an object. So you had to first fetch out the 0th index and then do .url to fetch out the URL value of that object. And this is very common. Objects shoved inside of arrays. So it hopefully shouldn't scare you that much the next time you come across that. So look at this list. It is really comprehensive. And now let's do a little thought experiment, which might help you feel less overwhelmed of all the things you don't know anything about in web development and all these fancy words. Because let's say that you for 2 weeks ago asked a developer, like, how do you create a Chrome extension? And then the developer arrogantly replied to you, well, it's not hard. You just add an event listener to a button, then fetch out the input.value, take that value stored in an object and convert it to a JSON using json.stringify, shoving it into local storage, no big deal. You can just fetch it out later and use json.parse in order to get it back into a JavaScript array, and then render it out in the function, shove it in as a parameter, and just use a template string and inner HTML to display it on the screen. I mean, no big deal, right? I mean, imagine getting such a reply. You would probably feel that you would never ever learn all of this because there's so many concepts you didn't understand. But actually, that reply from the developer is actually the exact thing we have done. And you have gone through it. So even though in and of themselves these names sound scary, you know that if you follow the right course, you can learn them. And you don't have to be afraid of any of the concepts you have yet to learn. Because whilst they sound super fancy from the outside, like JSON, actually, they're not that complicated when you look into them. So try to just have that confidence in yourself that you know you can learn complicated 3-letter acronyms, that they're nothing to be afraid of, because that'll calm you down and serve you well as you progress on this journey into web development. With that, let's actually put your skills to the test now, because you need some more repetition on these things. You need tons of repetition. These things take a lot of time to really get into your muscle memory. And we'll start with that in the next section, where you will do some quick challenges back to back. Let's move on. Or actually, before we move on, I want to remind you that you need to remember to take breaks, because as you are shoving all of this information into your brain, it needs time in order to process this new knowledge. And breaks and even sleep is a critical part of learning new things. Now, if you don't know what to do in your breaks, I want to give you a little tip, because we have a channel over at Discord that's called Scrimba Pets. And that is where you, the students, share pictures of your awesome pets. It is probably my favorite channel in our entire community, because you'll oftentimes see pictures of, for example, Pumpkin. That's the mascot here at Scrimba. And Pumpkin is actually, as you can see here, quite a decent programmer. And in the community, there are also other cats who are interested in web development, and even chickens. And of course, there are tons of cute dogs being shared every week in this Scrimba Pets channel. Now, if you have a pet, that is of course a great source of comfort and love, which will help you get through this career path. And we would love to see that pet in the Scrimba Pets channel, so that your dog or cat or pig or whatever can help spread some positivity in the community through this channel. So just click on this image and you'll get to that channel and check out all of the adorable pets you'll find throughout this community. And then once your break is done, you can return back to learning more JavaScript.